Okay, thank you very much for sticking around, I guess. So in the second lecture, again, the same motivation as before. I wanted to kind of talk a little about a topic where I could go into some detail, review the existing literature, as well as some recent kind of subtopics in the area that I've been working on. And so today we'll be talking about knowledge flows, trade, and learning by exporting. So why should we care about this somewhat broad topic? So, one obvious reason is, if we are hoping to grow, and every country would like to grow faster. I think developing countries in particular believe that there's the opportunity to maybe accelerate growth rates substantially through potentially policies such as trade reforms being one of those. So, from a policy perspective, understanding, what are the mechanisms, what type of policies might allow me to raise my growth rate are kind of really quite central. The second motivation, which is more from a kind of theoretical trade perspective, is if we go and look at, maybe our best identified kind of grab bag measures of what are the gains from trade when thinking about growth, where we regress, as I mentioned at the beginning of the last lecture, trade change the growth rate, the change in GDP per capita on some measure of trade exposure, suitably instrumented, we find numbers that are really quite large. Okay, we find kind of gains from trade much larger than those from something like Arkalakis, Costano, Rodriguez, Claret, which are kind of static models, the workhorse kind of models in trade. And so, one question here is, maybe there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on which isn't captured by our simple static models. And that's why, thinking about knowledge flows, thinking about learning by doing, thinking about learning by exporting, thinking about innovation, which Mark will be talking about next week, seems potentially important in order to kind of understand a kind of full picture. Now, given the history of the trade literature, most of the work has been on kind of these static models, which are easier to work with and maybe give us more satisfying results as well, since typically you can get anything happening once you bring in these dynamics. But that doesn't mean it's not of vital importance for us to try and think harder about these types of mechanisms. So kind of an aside, which resonates with me at least, is if we really believed in the models from those static estimates from those static models, there we're getting kind of gains from going all the way from autarky to trade to perfect free trade, ranging between 2 and 60%. There's some outliers if you're Belgium or something like that with big trading countries, but for most countries, just the gains from trade are quite small. And I guess my conjecture would be that if people truly believed that was all there was, then trade wouldn't be its own field. This is something that China would achieve in whatever it is, 6-7 years or something. That's all trade's doing. Instead, we think in the background that maybe trade played a very important role in China's rise, and in the absence of opening up to trade, maybe we would see much smaller GDP, much larger gains. Where would those have to come from? Would that have to come from these dynamic effects in particular, from kind of TFP improvements, from kind of knowledge flows, learning by exporting, potentially other things like disciplining firms, making government work better, etc. And so, in my mind, the kind of to get big numbers on the impacts of trade, you really need to think hard about these types of forces, and they're relatively understudied for that reason, given that this is where a lot of the action is likely to be, but not where a lot of our research is. So that's kind of a broad motivation for why it would be good to think about these topics. It's also a field that should be ripe for empirical work. Just the kind of theories we have, go and write down models which have concepts like technological spillovers and some parameter governing them. This is going to be, in kind of a pure trade context, but obviously in a spatial context. And we have these agglomeration spillovers, etc. And trying to actually go and kind of measure those seems crucially important. And I know some people in this room are thinking about related questions. So, with that motivation, let me kind of dive in and think about a kind of subset of this very big question of kind of trade and growth, and think more about kind of knowledge flowing within countries, across countries, and learning by exporting. So kind of a good starting point if you're interested in knowledge spillovers and openness is an exhaustive survey by Wolfgang Keller. That's looking at technological spillovers across countries. For people interested in spatial questions, there's an even larger literature looking at spillovers within countries that I'll talk more about today. There's kind of other, it's kind of broadly speaking, maybe two ways we might think about openness affecting kind of TFP. One is, through this knowledge spillover. So my TFP improves because as part of some kind of trading relationship, or because I'm exposed to other products, or because I'm close to other firms who have this knowledge, then we're going to see our TFP improve. I'm going to call these knowledge spillovers. They're going to be kind of hard to pin down, and we'll spend a lot of the day talking about them. And why they're hard to pin down? Well, we don't see kind of data sets of knowledge flowing. It's not something we kind of tabulate or statistics agencies measure. There's kind of a second mechanism where technology flows across countries, and that is technologies embodied in machines. Often when you ask a man in the street what they think about by technology, they often mean, oh, you've got a fancy machine. Those we do see move around the world, and so there's some work on those, thinking about kind of adoption of capital or capital equipment. And then the other thing we see very well in the trade data, or somewhat well, is intermediate trade. We see these goods flowing between countries. Why do I say only partially well? Well, sometimes it's hard to know if it's an intermediate or a final good. That's not typically marked in the data, but that's a kind of another area where we have good visibility. Why does intermediate trade matter? Well, you can write down a production function whereby the greater variety you have of inputs gives you a TFP boost. That's where the kind of Roma growth models generate growth from. Maybe you think of that, as not TFP, but instead, just the price index of the inputs changing. And so we could debate about that, but certainly that's been a kind of active literature in recent years, thinking about how inputs have potentially raised TFP when, say, India trade liberalized, for example, in the work of Penny Goldberg and co-authors. Okay, so I'm going to be focusing on the former of these, on knowledge spillovers. So a number of papers have looked at knowledge spillovers within countries, knowledge spillovers across countries. If we're thinking about within countries, those are particularly relevant for questions related to external economies of scale. If there are large knowledge spillovers within a country, either within sector or across sector, across firms within sector or across sectors, then these are external economies of scale or spillovers that justify a lot of our industrial policies. If we're thinking here about kind of spatial models, then these spillovers are one of the major forces for agglomeration effects, which obviously lie at the heart of those types of models. Okay, so I'm going to kind of talk about these sequentially. talk about flows within and across countries. Before doing so, just to kind of fix ideas, what do we mean by kind of knowledge spillovers? So Alfred Marshall has a well-known quote, when industry is thus chosen a locality, it's like to stay there, so great are the advantages, the mysteries of trade become no mysteries, but as it were, are in the air. Inventions and improvements in machinery and processes and the general organization of the business have the merits promptly discussed. If one man starts a new idea, it's taken up by others and combined with suggestions of their own. So I would think of, if one man starts a new idea, Mark's going to be talking about that, kind of trade and innovation, and I'll be talking about how those ideas dissipate rather than innovation. And obviously for developing countries, this is particularly interesting. We don't spend a lot of time thinking about innovation in developing countries, since much of that innovation takes place in the developed world. We think about kind of knowledge transfers to those developing countries, although obviously there's kind of adaptations or appropriate technologies that kind of break that dichotomy. Okay, so if we're trying to kind of capture whether knowledge is flowing either within or across countries, then we're going to need to measure knowledge. And as I mentioned, it's not directly observed. So what are we going to do? So the first thing is we can get a proxy for knowledge coming from kind of inputs to knowledge, which is R&D expenditure. We think this is creating knowledge. And much of the classic literature pioneered by Elhanan actually is going to look at how TFP changes when I'm trading with countries that do a lot of R&D. Okay, so there's, the inputs to knowledge are R&D, and that's going to see whether or not that some of that spreads to me. Then we need, that's an input to knowledge. We also often use various outputs of knowledge. The most common here is going to be patents. Okay, why patents? Well, we think that's a kind of new idea, and some of those new ideas benefited from existing ideas. And what's very nice about patents is this is all formally documented through the citation process. They cite the literature which is relevant to them, which they must know about if they're going to cite it. And so, much of the study of knowledge flows within firms is going to, within countries is going to use patents as a measure, or particularly patent citations as a measure. Then the other kind of outcome measure we use is, rather than saying, look, I think I saw this knowledge flow because I saw a citation, but instead it's going to be TFP, which is, I think I see knowledge flowing because these guys are becoming more productive. They're going and kind of implementing these new ideas. So we're going to touch on all of these three. Yeah.
Under the last one, are you just saying that anything you can't explain otherwise must be due to knowledge?
Well, certainly that's the nature of TFP, is it's everything I'm not able to explain through my other factors which I observe. Typically here we're going to do something a bit different, which is say, let me see how the change in that thing is related to something that plausibly might affect knowledge, the rate of knowledge flow or knowledge flows. But we need to be careful you don't have another story that may be falsely going into TFP that may also be affected. And we'll talk a lot about that, where, for example, markups often pollute TFP estimates, and those things obviously might change due to trade. And in fact, we have entire literatures talking about trade and markups and trade and competition. So that would be, that would be particularly relevant there. I guess a bigger question is, should we, be thinking about TFP as the literature typically does, as this residual? And is that just because we haven't, put in exactly the skill of the worker who had all this knowledge in them, and maybe that knowledge has some market rate? I need some quantity for that, and I just have some wage, and that we know that the labor markets aren't perfect. So yeah, maybe I'm not better at doing things. I just have a really good worker who's very smart, and I'm not paying him as much as I should be paying him or something. So my guess is a lot of TFP is that. But okay, so these are kind of different approaches people have used in order to get some empirical traction here. And kind of a very central challenge here is going to be the fact that if you think about the regression we're running, we're going to be regressing something about, one location's knowledge on another location's knowledge, measured in some of these different ways. And then the peer effects literature looms very large, particularly, when people are making endogenous choices to trade with each other. And then we think there might be other things that are similar about them. And we're going to be maybe loading too much of that on a knowledge flow. Okay, so, a good place to start here, at least on the empirical side, is Jaffe, Trachtenberg, and Henderson. I think Trachtenberg was at EBU, but someone else might know. At Tel Aviv. So yeah, we're close to the intellectual source. So this is one of the most cited papers in economics. I checked before the talk. I think it's at 10,500 sites right now. So worth mentioning. So this is really the first paper to try and provide some kind of prima facie evidence of these knowledge spillovers. And their innovation was, let me look at these citations, which now seems kind of obvious, but partly because we've seen thousands of papers, tens of thousands of papers that have cited them doing this. What they're going to try and do here is kind of systematically document that people tend to cite other firms close to them. And they're going to interpret that as evidence of knowledge spillovers. And kind of the logic here is that, this invention process is very much one of kind of building on the shoulders of giants. And so the more I know, the more innovation I can do. And what's nice about patents is there's a legal obligation to mention all prior art. It's basically everything you knew about which is kind of similar or related. And so they're kind of required to put down things they know about. And here they're putting down, maybe disproportionately putting down patterns as inspirations that are close by to them. And that's kind of some evidence that knowledge is flowing more locally than it is at higher distances. And so, their finding, as you might expect, is that you're much more likely to cite a firm locally to you than you might expect. But obviously, how exactly do you establish that? The big worry here is, think about Silicon Valley. Is the fact that Silicon Valley firms love to cite each other because they're all close together and so knowledge is flowing a lot? Or is it because all of the types of firms who are working on whatever patents related to AI all want to locate in Silicon Valley for a variety of reasons? So of course, they're all going to be citing firms nearby them because the type of firms they want to cite are all nearby them. So their idea here is to try and get a control group of like what patents would look like if they were just randomly taken from those types of topic areas. And so what they're going to do is you're going to start with a bunch of originating patents. These are the ones they start with, and they go and pull these at random, I think from a certain week or month, I think in the 70s or 80s. And then what they're going to do is see what proportion of the citing patents are in the same location as the originating patent. And then they're going to compare it to a control group where they take every patent that was in these citing patents, the ones that cited this innovation, and then they take an adjacent patent, one in the same subject area filed in the same week as this citing patent. And then they see how often do those patents go and cite people in this particular location. So this is controlling for the fact that there, if I took another AI innovation, they'd also all be citing Silicon Valley firms. And so the comparison wouldn't show that these AI firms are disproportionately, AI firms based in Silicon Valley are disproportionately citing them. Everyone's citing Silicon Valley firms. And so when you do that, you get kind of an excess citations of within the same metropolitan statistical area of about 8.6%, although a lot of those are self-sites. And so you get excess of about 4.3% when you do self-sites compared to the controls, which are 1% citing people in this MSA. So you have a difference of about 3.3% there. Things change a little bit by cohort or university versus corporate. The corporate numbers are higher, which is here. 4.5, 1.3, or 8.7, 1.2, depending if it's big or small corporate firms. So, this is obviously a good starting point. It is kind of suggestive that there is knowledge flowing within these locations. But of course, there's kind of a big worry lurking here, which is, okay, I have a control distribution here, but it's just based on, ones which are in the same pattern class. But maybe there's two types of AI, and there's guys using this approach and guys using that approach, and the guys, using approach A are all clustered in San Jose, and the guys using approach B are all clustered around New York. And then, I got the wrong control pattern, so I should have made sure that I got a control pattern that was also this type of AI rather than a different type of AI. Maybe we could argue is the reason that the two groups are doing different things because because knowledge didn't flow between them, but there's obviously a lot of other reasons why they may be doing similar things. So we're going to have to take this with a pinch of salt. So the subsequent literature kind of pushed as far as they could on this approach. There's a bunch of work that uses much finer industry definitions for control patterns to try and partially solve the issue I just raised there. There's a kind of a small set of papers that say, listen, why am I using the same MSA as the definition of being knowledge flowing? Why don't I do this continuously in distance and see whether the distributions are different between the control distributions? And then you can do a kind of a choice-based sampling approach using observables rather than just picking these control patterns in the same industry. But when you do these, the effects move around a bit. You find smaller effects if you do that, larger effects if you do that, and I think similar effects in the last case. So it's kind of held up that people do seem to disproportionately cite firms near them more, with these kind of caveats a little bit on are we missing some kind of peer effect going on here? Okay, so there's kind of a range of papers that kind of produce kind of related findings, which are all of interest. There's this nice paper by Sun and Storper, who go and do this at various different points in time. And somewhat surprisingly, this tendency to cite your own people close by you has actually increased rather than decreased over time. Why is that surprising? Well, identification issues aside, assuming that these are well identified, given communication technologies, we'd probably expect the opposite. The world is now flat, as Thomas Friedman famously said, and so these guys shouldn't, now have a world of science or a world of knowledge to learn from.
So what's the story then?
Well, so they don't have. Actually, they may speculate. So the story, and I'll talk about this to some degree here, although I won't have temporal variation. One explanation, which has been highlighted by Storper and Venables, is the type of technologies we have today. There's particularly high returns to collaboration and close collaboration, and so maybe that's a countervailing force. It is.
You can collaborate.
you can collaborate over distance more easily, but maybe the importance of face-to-face has been increasing, given the nature of the technologies. I mean, one thing, if you spend a lot of time thinking about patterns and studying them, and I've only spent a medium amount of time, so I wouldn't classify myself in that group, but I mean, the thing that's most kind of stark to me, at least, is some industries just don't cite each other, don't patent very much, because it's very hard to enforce those patents, and so they, just keep things secret instead. I guess a nice example of this is the candy industry, which, no one can tell by eating a Kit Kat whether it was made using your proprietary technology or someone else's proprietary technology. And so, unless you can go into their factory and work out how they're making it, which requires warrants and things like that, then they basically don't patent anything. So who does patent a hell of a lot? Well, the computer sector and such like, and that's obviously become a colossal sector where it wasn't before. So, how much of the kind of rise we're seeing in innovation is coming from now there's just been growth in the sector that patents a lot versus sectors that never patented that much, vis-a-vis actually the rate of innovation has sped up. And so then similarly, maybe the reason this is not decreased is because now such a large share is in these sectors where maybe actually distance was more important than we would think, and a reason why distance might be more important than think. I'll spend the next 20 minutes on. Yeah. Yeah, so one big issue here is strategic citations. So I knew about the neighbor's technology, but I thought my chance of getting a patent would be lowered. Obviously, it's illegal. The enforcement, how often people get in trouble, I don't know. I don't think it's so high. The examiner typically adds the relevant citations in back and forth with the applicant. So some of those are then picked up in those types of interactions, although also ones which maybe the applicant didn't know about is mixed up there as well. So this strategic citations is certainly an issue in this literature more generally. And in the paper I'll talk about next, it's maybe slightly less problematic given the variation we're exploiting, but it's something to think about. Yeah.
The local is crazy because there is so much research and so much patents that the ones I know are the ones are.
Yeah, so that is exactly how our best guess of how a lot of knowledge transfers work is I chat with people around me and I learn about what they're doing. And this is one of the big benefits of being in, say, Silicon Valley, is I chat with people around me. And the bigger the stock, there's kind of more to learn from them. And in terms of time series, we've seen kind of pretty constant number of patents per year up until the 90s. And then there's been an explosion in the last 25 years. Yeah. Increasing like the inventors and their knowledge with American companies are possibly. If you think there's some merging going on disproportionately close, and that's happening more over time, There's a lot of links to that story that would have to be established. My guess is quantitatively it would be small, but maybe not. Okay, so some other interesting papers, and there's a huge literature here. I'm just highlighting a couple. There's an Agrawal et al. Paper, which kind of compares spatial distance to social distance and shows that, as you might expect, patterns flow along social links as well. For example, if a kind of Indian engineer came up with something, another Indian engineer in another company is more likely to know about it than a Chinese engineer is. There's a very recent paper by Pauly and Stepanicic. They have a kind of a proximity specification for flows not within a city, but across cities. They exploit the kind of arrival of the jet engine. So this meant you could fly, I don't know, New York to LA directly rather than, I don't know, 3 stops or 4 stops. I don't know how many stops there was. So, you know, this massively reduced the cost of flying long distances within the US relative to flying short distances. And they show that, you know, citations between establishments located far away go up relative to citations located more close in a way that matches this kind of radius of, sorry, the flight distance of the jet engine. I'll come back to a bunch of airplane lit papers in a few minutes, which have been used to think about broader knowledge spillovers, given that we kind of typically think that, you know, while trade moves a lot via ships and slow means of transport, knowledge is often transported by humans, and air travel is the relevant one. And that's where, you know, if I'm doing freight, maybe the 3 stops doesn't really matter so much because I can go and aggregate a bunch of things. Obviously, it takes a little bit longer, but maybe the difference between 2 days and 1 day is not a big deal. Meanwhile, humans have a much higher value of time, so these direct flights matter much more for us than for freight. Yeah. We don't know yet. I guess these types of questions, I haven't seen a really good paper. They may be out there on trying to look at knowledge flows with and without the internet. There is obviously a lot of work doing that in some crude sense, but it's often hard to get exogenous variation. What we do have is papers, for example, looking at, you know, impacts on the various outcomes of faster internet in Africa, or the arrival of broadband to certain areas. You know, some of that is knowledge flowing, but there's a lot of other things going on. You know, I can now go and, you know, more easily go and book a flight or something online, or book plenty of things online, or my firm can, you know, set an online ordering system for inputs or something like that. It's not just the knowledge flowing. What is that? What is about those two things? Sorry.
What is the point of people fly, or it's about characteristics to see each other, or it's about
So the way this is identified, and we could, you know, maybe quibble about it or not, is you're going to compare places that the distance between them, the time taken to fly between them didn't change because they were a 2-hour flight away. I don't know, New York and Chicago versus, you know, New York and I don't know, Denver, where you would have had to change once. And so I see disproportionately, you know, citations between those two go up, and I can stick in city fixed effects. So it's not something generic about Denver or something generic about New York. It's specifically New York, Denver citations that relatively rise. And so, that in my mind is a reasonably plausible linkage towards something traveling via those airplanes. Have you totally nailed that it's people and knowledge rather than maybe some good flows and things like that? Or, another story here is maybe I can go set up FDI now. And because I've set up, sorry, FDI is the wrong word, but a subsidiary in Denver because of those direct flights and knowledge flows through those subsidiaries. And actually there's a very nice new paper by Xavier Giroux that I was going to mention briefly later, which if people are familiar with, there's a very well-known event study. We're looking at $1 million plants in the US. So when $1 million plant opens up, these are plants where there's like bidding wars between different localities. The new BMW plant, 5 or 6 different places are trying to give them tax breaks to get them. And they see, does the lucky winner, or does the winner who offers a slightly better package benefit in terms of their TFP compared to the kind of nearby losers? That's a Greenstone, Hornbeck, Moretti paper. And what Giroux has done with co-authors is they've gone and linked those $1 million plants. They know where they opened and where their subsidiaries went. And then they know the other firms nearby them where we see this TFP increase. And then they go and look at the other plants of these nearby firms. And they show that knowledge flows quite rapidly within the firm. So, BMW opens near my plant. I learn a bunch of stuff from BMW on how to run a factory. And then we see this knowledge spreading within the firm through their other plants.
Yeah. Just a small question about the you say citations between firms based on cities now potentially. I don't
Why
potentially? Why?
I see.
If they're now linked,
Well,
or do you get the same effect for cities that could be linked but actually are not?
So this is the instrument they're going to use. And so the endogenous variable is, you could think about it, whether there is a link. And then the instrument is, whether or not you could do that flight, and you'll be identifying off that variation.
But there could be one reason why they might not be linked, because these cities don't have much to say on that.
Correct. And so that would be a endogeneity concern here. And then you could think about your question being less that different from the IV, and I don't remember the answer. But this was a job market paper from this year. So, okay, so this slide has elicited more excitement than I was anticipating, which is a good thing. Now I'll kind of dive into some of my recent work, which thinks about one mechanism behind these knowledge spillovers, and that is these face-to-face interactions that we've been talking about in a lot of the discussion. So how are we going to make progress here? So kind of the centerpiece is very rich data we have on person-to-person interactions. And that's going to be measured by smartphone proximity. So we have kind of the raw pings from smartphones, essentially people who have downloaded a variety of apps. They've purchased the data from those apps. And we're going to call a meeting two people who are in the same place at the same time. Okay, we don't know if they actually met, but they were kind of near each other at the same time. And then we're going to match those kind of meetings to pattern citations between the employers of these smartphones, where we get the employers from essentially where these guys spend their days during the week. And this will allow us to maybe dive a bit deeper into the role of face-to-face interactions in generating these knowledge flows. Now, of course, there's a kind of key endogeneity concern here. There's several, but really the central one is that, these meetings are endogenous, which comes back to a version of Eric's point, which is, I'm going to potentially, learn about what someone's doing. It's interesting. We're working on a similar topic and arrange a meeting with them. Okay. If you haven't already, sometimes you'll send an email to a professor or a colleague saying, I'm working on this topic. I know that you've done work here. Can we chat? In that case, it's the citation, which you already had, that knowledge flow, that's generating the meeting, right? So we'd be quite worried about that. So our basic idea, which is going to very directly deal with this problem, and then we'll have to kind of amend it to deal with a variety of other problems, is rather than using the actual meetings and just hoping it's exogenous, we're going to use that's going to be endogenous, and we're going to instrument it with the meetings between a firm adjacent to you and a firm adjacent to the firm we're talking about the meeting with. So think about Apple and Google. We can take a meeting between a neighbor of Apple and a meeting between a neighbor of Google, and we'll make sure those are in very different industries, and that's going to deal with potentially spatially correlated types of the type of issues we talked about in the previous citation literature. And I'll come back in more detail to why this solves those problems, but the kind of central problem it solves is now the meetings are based not on the behavior of Apple and Google, who may endogenously meet each other based on what they're working on, but the behaviors of a neighbor of Apple and a neighbor of Google who are hopefully not working on that same topic. And so we're really, you can think of this as we're kind of finding the kind of chance variation in how much people meet with each other, and we're using that as an instrument for how much they actually meet with each other. So a lot of these meetings are going to be coming from bumping into people by chance, just because given where our two plants are located, we tend to go to the same coffee shop, or we tend to go to the same place for lunch, or we tend to use the same public transit routes, or we tend to live in similar areas. So what do we get from this? Well, it's very much a late estimate. It's the returns from face-to-face to face-to-face meetings induced by variations in this meetings geography of the city. What do I mean by meetings geography? I mean, if you take plant I and plant J, or establishment I and establishment J, the meetings geography is essentially the geography of amenities, the geography of housing, geography of transport infrastructure that separates I and J. And that'll be very different if there's kind of a big central business district in between you, or there's freeways, or etc. So it's this meetings geography between two firms that's kind of driving the instrumented changes in meetings, the instrument for the changes in meetings. Okay, so I'll show you those results. This estimate combines the returns to two types of meetings. The obvious one is kind of knowledge flows due to serendipity. Okay, and we're going to call these Jacobs spillovers because this was kind of one of Jane Jacobs' big ideas. Here's a quote from Ed Glaser: "Jacobs' greatest insight was that cities succeeded by enabling people to connect with one another. Many of the finest achievements of human civilization occurred because smart people learned from one another in cities, as Jacobs understood better than anyone else. The chance encounters facilitated by cities is the stuff of human progress." So we're trying to pick up this idea that these dense areas are full of people. Often in our context, the mechanism we have in mind is often there's an underlying social network. A lot of these people kind of know each other through previous jobs, through similar undergraduates, through friends of friends, and then they bump into each other quite often by chance, and that's really when a lot of knowledge flows. I didn't go and call up my whole kind of class from whatever, the Stanford computer science program to ask them about what I was working on, but when I bump into one of them in a park or something, we start talking about what we're each working on, and then knowledge flows. Oh, you should speak to so-and-so, they're doing something very similar, or in my company we're doing this or that. And so it's kind of activating links on this underlying social network. There's a second mechanism here, which is knowledge flows due to planned face-to-face meetings. So this is, I bring your team to my office, for example, would be an extreme version of that. Why are these also in our estimates? These are these local average treatment effects. Well, if you think about the variation driving them, imagine when I'm comparing two pairs of firms, I and J, and I1, J1, and I2, J2. And in one case, between us, we have all these coffee shops and restaurants, and it's walkable. And in the other case, between us is kind of, you have to cross two freeways, and it's no place I'd like to walk between. And I want to go and speak to someone in the other firm. In one case, they may say, let's go to a coffee shop, and we have a face-to-face meeting. In the other case, they say, let's speak on the phone. Or I may say, actually, let's not even bother doing that. Well, in the other case, let's say, oh, you know what? I'm at a coffee shop anyway. I'm going to have half an hour to kill. Let me go and chat to that guy. So in this kind of stories, actually, even this chance meeting variation is going to drive more planned meetings because it lowers the cost of them. You know, if there's good places to meet that are convenient to me, I'm more likely to meet you. And so we're going to be getting kind of a combination of those two. And what we're going to try and do is kind of separate, or what we'll be able to do is separate this role of serendipity from this role of planned face-to-face meetings. And I'll talk about how we do that shortly. Yeah.
I'm wondering if like these planned meetings are better in a way. Maybe I prepare for that, or maybe I Google for something. It could be that a chance meeting with them are less, more like set up a planned meeting. Like they're like a neighboring city that's maybe like half an hour from where I live. I might be, what, probably won't run into the other problem. So I might just set up a meeting with you. Then I'm more likely to Google them.
It's possible, yeah. So that they may be substitutes to some degree. Obviously, I may not end up bumping into you, but I bump into someone like you because I was kind of banking on me bumping into someone who would be useful. I mean, it's kind of like when I have an econometrics question and I can either arrange a meeting with an econometrician or the first one I bump into, I have that conversation with, and those things may be related. So that's interesting to think about. In reality, what we suspect, although can't prove, although we have suggestive evidence, is our instrument's not really moving these things very much, if at all. So we're not going to have much to say about planned meetings. And obviously, bringing someone else's team to your office for 6 months, we think that has huge returns, much more than like increasing the probability of me bumping into you in a coffee shop where chances are you don't have anything useful to share. And so we won't really have anything to say about the returns to collaborations, which are planned and things like that, face-to-face vis-a-vis on Zoom. And obviously, these estimates are going to be pre-COVID from 2017. So the world has changed a bit in terms of Zoom and how people use that. And so it's possible that these estimates would be different if the world is more used to Zoom when some of these non-face-to-face meetings have higher returns maybe now that you at least both have Zoom installed on your computer for one. Okay, so what more precisely are we going to be doing? So we're going to be pulling these smartphone pings from these apps. Our location data is going to cover about 50 million smartphones at the end of the sample. And of course, we don't have the universe of locations just because it only works when the phone's on, it has reception. When you have an app that's open or backgrounded that has permission to have your location. And so if we do see your phone at all in a day, we see it for about 15.6 hours. And a lot of phones we don't see at all. They never install whatever some messaging app that has provided these data to safeguard. Okay, so kind of the central object here is going to be these face-to-face meetings. What are they exactly? It's going to be the meetings between two people who are in the same geohash 7, that's about a city block, in the same half-hour window. And we don't have a long time series here, so I'm not going to be able to like track, these guys met in March, and then the citation appeared a year and a half later, and here's the kind of temporal lags, et cetera. Everything we're going to run is essentially going to be in the cross section. And so think of these really as the probability of me meeting people. And it's based on, how often am I in close proximity with them, given these pings. And so what we can do is we can take workers who we kind of categorize as belonging to firm I based on where they are 9 to 5 during the workday. And those based at establishment J, based on a similar approach, the same approach. And I'm going to take calculate this meetings probability as the total meetings between I and J. Say we could do this in a particular 15-minute window of our data set. And then divided by the total potential meetings, which is the number of workers who I observe pinging from each firm in that 15-minute period. So imagine I observe 3 workers at one firm and 4 workers at another firm, pinging in that particular 15-minute window, and 1 from one and 2 from another happen to be in the same coffee shop at that point in time, or were in the same coffee shop at that point in time. Then there's going to be 2 actual meetings over a potential 12 meetings. And this is giving kind of a probability of them meeting. Probability from all of those half-hour periods in all different locations. So what is this object, this total meeting probability? It's the probability that a random worker from I meets a random worker from J. And why is this useful to us? Well, firstly, the fact that the probability, it's kind of scale invariant is helpful because some firms we just have very few workers because they have smartphones which don't have these apps on them or other reasons. Secondly, it maps quite nicely to a particular type of knowledge flow, which might be our main conduit, which is an inventor on I's pattern meets an inventor on J's pattern. That's when knowledge flows and results in citation. So what we're looking for here is the probability that the inventor at I and the inventor at J meet each other. So what do these kind of meetings look like? So this is kind of where Google workers from their head office ping. This is red. This is where Apple workers from their head office ping. Obviously concentrated around those campuses, but also spread across. That's just the raw ping data, but obviously sometimes one person's always there in the morning, one person's always there in the afternoon, they're not going to meet each other. This is when they're in the same place at the same time. Here it's much more sparse. Where are these locations? It's small, so there's everything from offices, Google office, apartment complexes, supermarkets, shopping malls, residential area. So there's a mix here of kind of work locations as well as these are the actual meetings between Apple and Google. I can go and calculate my total probability measure between Apple and Google. I can also go and do that for Apple and every other establishment in the Bay Area. This is why the Bay Area, well, we're interested in Silicon Valley seems a good place to study these knowledge flow face-to-face meetings, and we have to start somewhere. So if I take Apple, red means that the model meetings are high probability, blue less so. They don't tend to meet very often. The people working over in the Sacramento are also over here. So they need to love the people in terms of the Bay Area, and then we'll have to San Francisco, where obviously most of them work live. So as you can see, there's plenty of variation. For whatever reason, I'm here and there, and maybe that's closer to restaurants.
Excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we cannot hear you anymore. I think the microphone on your shirt is not working. It's only the one on the table is working now.
Let me try and speak in here for a few minutes.
Thank you.
Battery issue. Sorry, to repeat the question, could they be driving in traffic? There's an algorithm which basically you know how quick you're moving, and so we have removed all of those who are moving faster than walking distance. It's possible if you're in stopped non-moving traffic, it's very hard to differentiate between that. And so there might be a little bit of error coming from that. Everything's bilateral, so you need to think through exactly what error that might lead to. What it would mean is, people who go on similar commutes, we're going to say are more likely to meet each other, but I think that's also true. Going to similar places originally. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, so those are the actual meetings. These are the citation flows. We've taken a sample here, and we're going to overlay those two. Thicker lines means more citations between those establishments. So just to kind of think through this estimating equation, we're going to be regressing citations between I and j on this total meetings probability between I and j. Is that my echo? Between the total meetings between I and j, we're going to have I and j fixed effects, and we can include controls. And the most obvious control is going to be distance between I and j. So we'll say, conditional on these firms being equally far apart, if these guys have a high meetings geography, they have lots of restaurants and bars between them, then we'll see different amounts of citations between them. Okay, so as I mentioned, kind of the key issue here is this reverse causality. You're working on similar things, you organize meetings to discuss them. Here, the kind of main solution is this instrument that means I'm not actually going to use the meetings between I and j, but their neighbors who are going to be working on different things. And so that will serve as a valid instrument, really kind of leveraging the fact that these guys next to me are going to go to similar places to me. The kind of meetings geography separating I and j is going to be similar to the neighbor of I and the neighbor of j's meeting geography. What is what, sorry? Some controls, which I haven't mentioned yet. Okay, we have some more complicated stories, maybe amenities or endogenous meetings demand. Apple and Google want to meet each other loads, so a coffee shop opens up. So here we're going to restrict to these neighbors meetings, but only those more than 5 kilometers from either establishment. So it's hard to believe that this coffee shop says, you know what, I'm still 7 kilometers away from Google, but like maybe they'll all come here. Well, it might be relevant if they're 200 meters away or 500 meters. Okay, establishments may also locate endogenously. And this is where it's much more difficult to deal with this. And one kind of simplest worry is, I want to learn from Intel, I want to supply them, etc. I move next door to them. We know a lot of suppliers do that. So we're going to be controlling for physical distance between them, right? So, and also driving distance, etc. So, if I want to locate them next to them so I can go and visit them, we're going to be controlling for that. And so what's the residual variation? Well, some places are equally far apart. It's a 7-minute drive in both cases, but in one case, there's all these amenities in between, in the other case there aren't. Okay, kind of the more complicated issue here is that we might think that kind of worker similarity is spatially correlated or such like. And so kind of an obvious story here would be that the places where people with PhDs like to live are very different to the places where manual workers like to live. And if I'm going to need a lot of PhDs, then I'm going to kind of put my office closer to them. And if I need a lot of manual workers, I'll go and put my office closer to those guys. And then what I'm picking up here is the fact that we both like to hire manual workers. That makes us more likely to cite each other, or PhDs are more likely to cite each other. And that's what's driving these outcomes. So we can do a few things. The most obvious is we can just control for the differences in the labor force of these two firms. And in particular, we know where these people live based on where they go at night, and we know the census block group demographics, and so we can control for the proportion with higher degrees or income or race, etc. The other thing we can do here is restrict this instrument further, and in particular, we're going to throw out any not I, not j, these neighbors of I and these neighbors of j pairs who are in the same industry or have industries have ever cited each other, or they supply or buy from each other. And this is throwing out more than half of the pairs. And essentially what we're saying is, I'm not very confident that I've dealt with this problem if I take, one firm that does AI and one firm that does a computer architecture. Those industries cite each other a lot. I'm quite worried about them both locating in Palo Alto, or one locating in Palo Alto and one located in San Jose. They both located exactly where they did because they wanted access to engineers. I'm much more confident if, one is a whatever medical device supply company and the other one is a restaurant service company. These industries have never had any patent links, and most industries obviously do have some patent links, and so we're more likely to be capturing these kind of kind of pure chance meetings rather than ones based on similar characteristics of workers. Okay, so how does this look in practice? Here's Apple's headquarters, here's Google's headquarters. I'm taking the neighbors of Apple and Google. These are the meetings of those neighbors. They don't have many neighbors because their campuses are so big, and we're looking just within a narrow range for the neighbors. And we have places that look reasonable. This is a restaurant here, a shopping mall, an apartment complex, residential location. And then within 5 kilometers, there are places we might worry a little more about. This cafe may have sprung up endogenously to serve these meetings, possibly a bunch of work locations as well, Google's offices, the Shoreline Amphitheater where they do their presentations, as well as a college. And so essentially our instrument's just going to rely on this variation outside these 5 kilometer rings, which is more worrisome from an endogeneity point of view, also more worrisome if firms do actually know this data and they decide to locate just on the side of Intel with the coffee shop rather than the side without the coffee shop. Presumably that would just depend on nearby amenities rather than 5 kilometer away. Do you have a question? Okay, so what does this variation look like once I go and do the exact same thing, but now using the neighbors of I and neighbors of J? And it's certainly true that close by you're more likely to cite as you were before, so you're more likely to meet as you were before. But now, for example, it's not saying you're much more likely to meet in San Francisco. Presumably that's coming from the fact that a lot of those meetings are kind of more directed, or between workers in very similar industries. The ones that are more worrying from an endogeneity point of view, these chance meetings are driven more by geography, physical distance, for example. Okay, so what do we get when we do this? We find that there's reasonably large impacts of citations on these meeting probabilities. We can kind of do this just with the OLS, and we see that we do see adding physical distance attenuates that effect, although not by an enormous amount. So in fact, when both are in the regression at the same time, most of the action is on the total meetings probability, and the coefficient on physical distance kind of drops by 2/3. So this whole literature that's been kind of thinking about physical distance as a kind of proxy for these knowledge spillovers, since we think that these are working through things such as meetings that decay with distance. Well, this suggests that we're getting a much less noisy measure of what matters for these knowledge spillovers. It's whether you're meeting each other rather than the fact that I'm a mile away is less important than the fact that we're bumping into each other a lot. When we use our IV, the coefficients go up a lot. Most of our stories have a downward bias. Why are they going up a lot? Well, as always in applied work, you say the word measurement error and everyone shuts up. Here we can actually go and do something about that, which is I can calculate a pure measurement error effect by essentially setting up a chessboard and using the black meetings on black squares as an instrument for meetings on white squares, which but they're using the actual meetings, not any instrument meetings, and that's just going to deal with the measurement error, not the endogeneity. And sure enough, we have huge attenuation here. These aren't actual meetings. Remember, this is whether I was in the same place at the same time, and so it's not surprising we have a lot of noise. And then our preferred specification using that no more than 5 kilometer IV with all our controls for demographics, etc. It's in this last column. Okay, how big are these numbers? So this elasticity is twice what you would have got if you just projected this on distance. And so a 10% increase in meetings matters twice as much as a 10% reduction in distance, to give you a kind of sense there. Or put another way, if I bring meetings down 1%, that's going to reduce citations by about 1/4%. And if we reduce them by 25%, you're getting 8%. So these are reasonably substantial, we can do work from home counterfactual and ask what if everyone or half the people start working from home, adjust for the fact that you're going to be bumping into people at home more because there'll be more people working from home, and making some back of the envelope assumptions, and we get kind of meetings decreasing by about 18% or 17.5%, and about 5% citation reduction if half of the firms move to work from home, or half of the workers. Okay, so just the last thing which I'll briefly mention is it seems like face-to-face meetings matter, and they matter, I guess, more than physical distance does. But is this the returns to serendipity, or is it kind of a mixing together of those returns to serendipity or the returns to face-to-face meetings? And why is this interesting? Well, if you're a fan of Jane Jacobs, as I am, then it's interesting to know how important this kind of serendipity effect is. And kind of the key issue here is if you think that patent citations depend on both chance meetings, that's the serendipity effect, and planned meetings, that's the non-serendipitous meetings, then in order for me to kind of actually estimate these returns to these two of these separately, I need two instruments, one for planned meetings, one for chance meetings. On top of that, I need two endogenous variables, planned meetings and chance meetings. Maybe I can find the instruments, and I'll suggest some in a second, but I'm not going to be able to partition the actual meetings I observe into planned and chance. Why? It's just smartphone proximity. There's no flag saying, oh yeah, this one was planned ahead of time, and I cross-checked it with your calendar, and this one wasn't. So we're not able to run this regression because I don't know what these things are. But what I'll argue is that I can tell you if our estimates are reflecting the returns to serendipity if I have two instruments, if I have the instruments I would need to run this regression and do causal inference. Okay, and the logic is quite simple, which is if I make two assumptions, firstly, we have two instruments, they differentially affect chance and planned meetings. And so, the first stage would be chance meetings depends on Z1 and Z2 with coefficients K1 and K2 that differ from coefficients pi1 and pi2, which is unplanned. And if I assume that at least one of our instruments affects chance meetings, so I assume that either kappa 1 or kappa 2 is non-zero, then I can separately run my IV with one instrument than the other instrument. If I get the same coefficient either way, then one of two things must be true. Either the returns to planned and chance are the same, i.e. gamma 1 equals gamma 2. And so it doesn't matter which instrument I'm using, the fact that one instrument is loading relatively heavily on planned and the other relatively heavily on chance, it doesn't matter. Or the alternative is I don't have a first stage for one of these two, and by assumption I say I have a first stage for this, so I must not have a first stage for this one. In that case, all I'm getting is the returns to serendipity. That's why I'm getting the same coefficient with either IV in both cases. And so, this suggests coming up with two IVs that satisfy these criteria, doing an over-identification test. And what we can use here is we can split our kind of meetings into we can split our meetings into those that occur at night or the weekend versus those that occur in the day. And the logic is, if we do have a first stage for planned meetings, you'd think that these kind of meetings of neighbors of I and J occurring on evening and weekend are going to be relatively smaller cost shifters of the cost of having a meeting with you. So, if it's very convenient, I'm often in this coffee shop at lunch during the workday, and that's near you as well. That sounds like something that might be a cost shifter of a planned meeting. The fact that we're both near at the same park on the weekend with our kids is going to be less of a cost shifter for a planned meeting. So we don't require that this is not a cost shifter at all, just that the relatives are different between those two types of meetings when I'm comparing planned meetings and chance meeting first stages. So that seems quite reasonable, and given we're still using these neighbors meetings, if any of these things is going to have a first stage, it certainly is with chance meetings, given that's where all the variation is coming from. And sure enough, just look at these three columns, we find very similar coefficients with either instrument. And so we don't know whether it's because we don't have a first stage, or we don't know whether it's because the returns are the same for this type the kind of planned meeting induced by this variation, but we can conclude that we're identifying the returns to serendipity. Okay, so any questions before I push on? So that was a kind of deeper dive. I'll do one more in the last 10 minutes, I think. So, so far we've been talking mostly about spillovers within countries. In fact, entirely about spillovers within countries. Obviously, these are particularly relevant within city when you think about spatial questions, urban economics, etc. Also, for those questions related to is the world getting flatter, then as we discussed, these mechanisms are relevant. Why did I spend so much time on kind of within countries or within cities? Well, one of the reasons is that for good or for bad, the literature looking at knowledge spillovers across countries is much less developed. And in particular, there's kind of enormous literature from the 80s and 90s that is pretty crude, and there hasn't been a lot of work since then. So the starting point here is this Cohen-Heltman paper from 1995. And this is actually Elhanan Heltman's most cited work. You can maybe ask him about him if he's at another event. I think even he would be willing to admit that it might not hold up to the latest empirical standards. In particular, he's going to regress country level TFP on import share weighted R&D stocks. And so if I'm trading with countries that do a lot of R&D, is my TFP higher? Okay, and there's not going to be country fixed effects in this regression. And so, there's a lot of other things that, countries that trade a lot with America maybe have higher TFP for a variety of other reasons. The other thing which is maybe most damaging to this literature is in an influential series of papers, Wolfgang Keller showed that I could go and stick random weights rather than import weights on the R&D shares of my trading partners, and I actually get stronger coefficients. And so you would worry a little bit when that really trade is a mechanism if it performs less well than when you randomize the trade component. So Cohen-Heltman have a bunch of extensions, similar specifications. Keller improves on this by running it at the industry time level. And this may be kind of the state of play now. We're going to look at on physical distance, which means that now we're getting a much more all-encompassing notion of geographic spillovers, but doesn't require us trying to identify a mechanism that we may not have the variation to do so. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to say, I'm going to do a panel here, and I'm going to control for industry country fixed effects, and I'll say over time, if we see variations here in R&D in certain countries and not others, differentially closer to you. So if there's a bunch more R&D in a country that's close to you than further away, then do I grow faster or at a faster rate than my country fixed effect would suggest? The answer is yes. Every additional 1,200 kilometer in distance has a 50% drop off in diffusion. So more recent work, there's a bunch of things on knowledge spillovers of various types. A Griffith, Lee, Van Reenen paper, which looks at the speed at which patents get cited and kind of runs duration models. There's a very well cited Bloom, Shankerman, and Van Reenen paper, which has a smart idea of saying, let me look at spillovers that kind of allow us to separate technological proximity from product market proximity, which we might think is more like business stealing, which maybe confounding these results, so it's an interesting additional mechanism, additional force, and you're essentially going to calculate these separately based on how similar are the inputs, how similar are the outputs. There's some work on technology transfers. There's a set of relatively recent papers, as I mentioned, that exploit airlines. Why airlines? Well, as we talked about in that Pooley and Stepanicic paper, we think that people move a lot on airlines, and so knowledge flows that way. Catalini, Fonsoes, and Gaulle show that when Southwest serves two markets, it puts a flight between two destinations. Already there were typically flights between them, but when Southwest comes in, those flights fall in price rapidly. Not just the Southwest is cheap, but the competitor lowers their prices a lot. And so here you're essentially moving from a monopolist serving a route to having two competitors, or at least that's the kind of variation going to driving our results. And they find more collaboration between scientists in chemistry and the mathematicians. And they can kind of break that out into kind of better matches. And in particular, what seems to be going on a lot, at least for the chemists, is, I want to use some specialized equipment, and now I can do those collaborations if I can like fly once a month at a cheap price, which I wasn't going to do when it was very expensive. Giroux has a paper showing new airline routes between headquarters and subsidiary, increase the productivity of the subsidiary, which sounds a lot like managers going between those plants more often, doing more monitoring. And Catalini has this random reassignment on a temporary campus when they were dealing with asbestos to show that being put next to new people leads you to work in closely related subjects to the people you're next to, with positive spillovers from those new collaborations. Three more papers which I particularly like. There's a Campenti and Yanagisawa drop paper. They're going to exploit now well-known, but at the time little-known fact that at about 6,000 miles, it becomes disproportionately expensive to put a direct flight on. This is coming, I think, primarily from the rule that you need to have two crews in order to do a flight that long. And so the cost for the airline massively goes up when you have to fly more than 6,000 miles because one crew is not allowed to fly that long. And so you get this discontinuity that only kind of appears when essentially they had kind of modern fuel efficient airplanes. It starts to appear with 6,000 miles. Previously, it was just too expensive to fly all that fuel in the first case. Obviously, they might do it between, New York and I don't know, some big city 7,000 miles away, but a super big market. It's a 23-hour flight to Singapore, whatever it is, from New York direct. That's generally going to be much harder to make profitable. And what they show is that you see at this 6,000 mile discontinuity, you as a city grow faster when you're connected to more cities versus less. So, two places that are maybe quite close to each other, but one of them happens to be just over the threshold of flying to Western European capitals, and the other one is just under that threshold. And the one that's just under the threshold will have a lot more economic activity based on night lights, or a bunch more. And the primary conduit seems to be FDI flows. I'm more likely to open up a subsidiary or to work with companies or use them as suppliers when there's a direct flight that's kind of possible here. And I guess one kind of anecdote here is that I think Apple, I'm now blanking on the number, but holds back, I forget, is it maybe 55 or something like that, business class tickets every single day from San Francisco to Shanghai or Shenzhen, I forget which one, but there's a huge amount of movement going on between these. And obviously if they had to change, that's a major disincentive for them to open that factory there. There's two papers which really try to get into kind of the micro movements of people. One Mion et al. And some related papers, which actually look at when a sales manager moves between firms. Do we see them bring with them their knowledge of which countries to serve? And it's not surprising the answer is yes, but they can identify that cleanly from social security data and customs records. So a guy who previous company was exporting a lot to Angola, if moves to your firm, they also start exporting a lot to Angola. So consistent with there being some local knowledge. Bistre, Corin, and Seidel look at the other direction. Do I learn about where to import from my peers? And there, they're going to use addresses and exploit kind of having very detailed map data. And it turns out that, you know, having another company on the same side of the road as you on the same blog matters a lot more than them being on the other side of the road, for example, which is partly due to the structure of buildings in Budapest, which seemingly is kind of big blocks which have a lot of semi-connected buildings as well. Can really get into the kind of micro geographic spillovers. Okay, in the last 8 minutes, I wanted to change tack slightly and think about knowledge spillovers of a very specific form, which is called learning by exporting. What are those knowledge spillovers? It's the idea that the kind of process of exporting leads my TFP to rise. And you know, one mechanism here is just scale economies. Typically, we wouldn't think of those as actually raising TFP, but maybe we didn't measure it well. But the kind of purest form of learning by exporting is the idea that knowledge diffuses from knowledgeable buyers or intermediaries who kind of, you know, particularly when poor countries are selling to rich countries, you know, the idea that this kind of you know, big American multinationals buying from you and a bunch of knowledge kind of flows to you on best practices, etc., through that relationship. And so, you know, this is obviously different to kind of learning by doing, which may also be occurring. The difference being that, you know, learning by doing doesn't have anything fundamentally to do with me trading with a foreigner necessarily. If I could potentially have got big customers domestically, or they would have asked me to do new things. Where the foreigners come in is maybe only the foreigners have that knowledge, which I can learn from, rather than I'm learning it myself through trial and error. Okay, so this is kind of a classic literature in trade. Using kind of panel studies, we found not much. Using more updated panel studies of DeLoca, trying to do a good job estimating TFP using kind of more modern techniques. We find something, but from only when exporting from Slovenia to high-income countries. But you know, overall, some kind of mixed findings here. So, you know, I have a paper which tries to test this very directly to ask whether or not technical efficiency does improve through the active exporting via these knowledge spillovers. And how are we going to do that? So we're going to kind of combine a measurement and an experiment. And apologies for the change in slides. We were PowerPoint people at that point in our lives. So there's kind of two issues here. The first is I want to know if exporting affects productivity. All of you are probably familiar with the Melitz model. In that model, we think there's a selection such that I can't just see if you're an exporter, and of course exporters are more productive, but a lot of that selection. Maybe we can deal with that in the panel and, you know, stick in fixed effects, but then also, you know, if firms change in their productivity over time, then we should see them starting to export, and we still have that endogeneity problem, and these things might come together. You know, I'm becoming more, you know, new manager comes in, I become more productive because of the new manager. They also have, you know, want to start exporting. These things might come as a package. So we're going to deal with that first through randomization, and we'll talk about how we do that in a second. And then the second issue, which is equally serious, is it's really hard to measure TFP because typically we don't have the data we need to do it. The first issue is we often don't have actual quantity data, so we rely on revenue data to estimate TFP. As is well known, there's kind of biases there, particularly if markups are changing, and we think markups are likely to change with trade, or might well change with trade. So you might think, let's just use quantity-based measures if we have the data, and that's kind of what we're going to do. But as we'll show, it's pretty hard to do that. And the reason it's pretty hard to do that is because the product mix changes dramatically. We have a lot of work showing that when you export, you often upgrade your quality, particularly if you're a poor country. And so, you know, we can't do this easy comparison of making the same thing over time. Essentially, we're comparing apples to oranges. I'm making a, you know, crappy VW Beetle, and now I'm making a fancy Jetta in kind of the imagery from Eric Verhoeven's paper. And so what we'd be worried about is that if we measure improvements in TFP or actually worsening TFP potentially, that may simply be movements along the PPF. I'm making different things. And the way I measure TFP is going to say, oh, well, your productivity has gone down or up, when actually your PPF hasn't shifted in or out at all. You're just making different products for export markets. So how are we going to solve these two issues? We're going to be in northern Egypt, where they make these types of kind of flat weave rugs. And we found 219 firms making these rugs in a kind of rug making hub, a town. And 74 are going to be treated. That's a budget constraint. And we partnered with a NGO, Aid to Artisans, and a local intermediary. And essentially, we got a whole bunch of export orders on international markets from trade fairs, etc., with the help of this NGO. And then we went and randomly allocated this opportunity to export, usually for the first time, to these 74 firms. And so what exactly were these export orders? So this is what our kind of rugs look like that we managed to get orders for. That's for a German interior decorator. This is a decorating company or interior design company. This is for ABC Carpet and Home in New York. And these differ on two dimensions. The first is they're higher quality. They're higher quality, but on two dimensions. The first is they have more demanding specifications. The patterns may be more complicated. They use finer wool, which is softer but harder to deal with, for example. And that stuff you can specify. Here's a spec sheet, for example. The thing which you can specify is kind of these intangibles that affect quality. In particular, the big one for a rug is how flat it lies on the ground. And it's hard to contract over that. They don't contract over it, but the more skilled the weaving is, the more skilled the firm is, the better the rug is. And so kind of these are things which depend on the firm's skill and affect quality. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So what's our treatment? An initial order of 110 meters square. That's about 11 weeks full-time work for these firms. Everything else was left to the intermediary, the market price, what they did subsequently. The control group just didn't get this initial order, and the intermediary was asked not to subsequently order from the control group for the period of our study. So, they're allocating future orders as any intermediary would. If the producer failed to produce the initial order, they wouldn't follow up. If they produce them well, they would. And so we're giving this opportunity to export to these high income markets. What do we find? Well, massive increases, as you'd expect, in whether they've ever exported. That's not surprising. We've kind of tried to shock them in, but it's good that we find impacts on exporting. We find profits go up, measured in different ways. Profits per owner go up by about 30% in the TOT, 20% in the intent to treat. That accounts for the fact that many of these owner-operated firms, and so their labor supply may increase. Slightly more, foreigners have got an increase in demand, so the fact that their profits go up is maybe not surprising, or the fact that prices go up. What's more surprising is that the hours worked go up by 5 or 8%, depending on the TOT or the IDT, but the output actually falls. So they're making less per hour. Why is the output falling? Well, the obvious reason is this is output in meters squared, which is a standard measure of output of rugs, but that doesn't account for the quality. And if the foreigners are demanding much higher quality, it takes longer to make, output actually falls. They're also doing longer production runs consistent with economies of scale. So what is kind of obvious here is that if you just use standard productivity measures in quantities, you're going to find productivity falls, right? Because the quality is going up. So you need to account for that. So we went and did extensive quality surveys where we sent in experts to kind of rate the quality on 11 dimensions. And these qualities are going way up. And so that's kind of consistent. They kind of lie flatter, they're softer to touch, they're more accurate designs, etc. And so these guys are making higher quality rugs, they're taking longer to make. Okay, and that's why output per hour is falling, or some unadjusted TFP where we just crudely go ahead and use the formulas. Okay, so there's kind of two stories here. One is that foreigners were saying, make me high quality. I already knew how to make high quality. TFP doesn't change, but it's going to be really hard to measure. And I may say it does. The other is, I didn't really know how to do this stuff. You taught me how to make high quality. My efficiency improves. Okay, and how do we kind of separate? This is one movement along the PPF versus a shift out. So kind of the cleanest way is, we can go and potentially control for characteristics. That does reverse this effect, but it's always going to be imperfect, particularly when there's little overlap in this kind of specifications of the rugs. So it's true that conditional on thread count, for example, we do see productivity go up. What we can do that's kind of more precise is we can actually ask them to make the exact same product. So we brought them into a lab we'd set up. Most of these, the primary weaver is the owner of the firm, and ask them with materials we provided to go and make rugs. And then we could send those off to be quality graded. So even making the exact same domestic specification rug, these guys were making substantially higher quality. And it took them actually less time, not more. So this is kind of strong evidence of this PPF shifting out. They can make the same domestic rugs, higher quality, and slightly faster. Okay, and maybe this wasn't information flows, but just learning by doing. But here we can kind of track the information flows. We can track the emails from the intermediary, from the buyer to the intermediary, and then from the intermediary to the firm. We know all the visits of the employees of the firm, the intermediary firm to the firm, and what they talked about. And we show that the kind of biggest changes in quality occur on the particular areas that they kind of talked about most with the intermediary. So the intermediary is kind of collecting knowledge from buyers and then passing it on to firms. And most prominently, kind of how to hold your fingers to get the rug to lie flat on the ground, which is all about, essentially the finger position you have. And it's the kind of thing, once you've learned, you stick with it. It's costly to change your finger position just to make a domestic rug, and now they're making these higher quality rugs. Okay, so I'll wrap up. There's a closely related paper just come out of the QJE on the impacts of entering multinational supply chains in Costa Rica, also finding productivity rising. Here, knowledge is flowing from a foreign firm in your country rather than a foreign buyer outside your country, but through some of these same mechanisms. So I've only scratched the surface of empirical topics on the intersection of knowledge flows, trade, and learning. Particularly, I haven't covered some of the quantitative recent work, looking at trade and growth that are kind of micro-founding knowledge spillovers, or some industrial policy questions related to can shifting into sectors with greater learning by doing raise growth, and obviously trade may shift you into those sectors. And Mark will cover related topics on trade and innovation. Does trade raise the returns or dampen them? The returns to innovation? There's a big literature there. And finally, there's a lot of exciting topics related to trade and growth. And I'll just reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is empirically, this is likely where the action is. It's not where our models are, for good reasons if you're a theorist, but maybe not good reasons if you're an empiricist not to think more about this. Even though the path is slightly more difficult, it's harder to identify growth effects than it is to identify cross-sectional effects, for example. Okay, thank you very much. That's a wrap. I'm happy to answer any questions.
One question about the literature. You talked about trade with knowledge and export. Imagine that there's knowledge transferred by importing. If I have a high-tech import, I learn something from the supplier. Is that worth exploring? Has it been explored?
Yeah, so one version of that, which is the one I mentioned briefly at the beginning, which has been explored a lot, is does access to more intermediates or cheaper intermediates raise firm performance? And then there's a question of, do we call it TFP if I now get a better widget, or is that just a reduction in the quality adjusted price of that widget? I would probably say the latter. There's a different force, which I think you're hinting at also, which is, maybe I go in backward you know, I go and deconstruct an import that I get, and I see how they made something, and then I copy it.
Maybe I talk to the supplier.
I talk to the supplier.
I'm wondering how they do it.
I learn something, and then cut them out. That particular mechanism, I'm not aware of a lot of evidence or any evidence that directly thinks about that, although obviously there's going to be some element of that going on. Yeah, so some of that is, you know, a lot of this could be done with samples, right? So you kind of need a story where like the quantity of imports matters. And then often I think it's more about, I don't know about those other products. If I knew about them, I could have gone and got the sample. But because I didn't know about them, I only see them when they show up in my country. What we do know is there's a very nice paper, which is really three qualitative studies. Three qualitative case studies by Juan Carlos Halak and co-authors, Topoulos and Halak and someone else, where they make the point, they looked at Argentina and they look at three of the biggest export success stories. And all three cases, they had very substantial links from the CEO to the US. In one case, they went to grad school in the US. In the other case, they were spending a lot of time in the US, et cetera, and making the point where, you know, they knew something about that market, which allowed them to penetrate that market. And so, you know, some of this is, you know, if I've never left, you know, my particular country, then maybe I don't see a bunch of these products, and I don't realize that, hey, I could be doing my product differently. And so some of that you might think international travel may be a substitute for that, and then I bring back samples or going on, you know, reconnaissance visits and things like that. But it's an interesting mechanism that I think would be good to have more evidence on. Thank you.